A staged conflict is a quarrel that is planned in advance. At least, that's how I always understood it. Most people think arguments happen because emotions get out of control. Mine didn't. The most important argument of my life was written almost like a script. I've never posted anything like this before, but after carrying it around for years, I guess I want to tell the story somewhere. Not because I'm proud of it. Not because I'm looking for sympathy. Mostly because it still follows me, even now. My name is William, and years ago I committed a crime that changed the way I saw myself forever. Back then, I was drowning in debt. Nothing dramatic at first, just bad decisions piling on top of worse ones. A failed business venture, credit cards I couldn't pay off, loans from friends I kept promising to repay. Every morning felt like waking up with a weight on my chest. The person closest to me during that period was my cousin, Eric. He owned a small electronics warehouse and was doing reasonably well. Not rich, but comfortable. Comfortable enough that I envied him. That envy slowly turned into something darker. The idea came to me after a family gathering where Eric and I got into a minor disagreement. Everyone noticed it. A few relatives even joked that we looked ready to kill each other. We laughed it off. But on the drive home, I couldn't stop thinking about their reactions. People believed conflict when they saw it. They remembered it. And if something happened later, they would connect the dots exactly the way they expected to. That was the moment the first seed was planted. I didn't immediately decide to commit a crime. At least that's what I told myself. I convinced myself I was only imagining possibilities. Thinking through scenarios. Looking for a way out of my financial disaster. But over the following weeks, the idea kept returning. A public feud. A convincing one. Something everyone would remember. At the time, I had no idea how far that single thought would take me, or how many lies I would have to tell before it was over. Looking back, this was the point where I crossed the line. The debt collectors weren't knocking on my door yet, but I knew they would be eventually. Every bill felt like a countdown clock. Instead of finding a legitimate solution, I became obsessed with making my situation look different from what it really was. The staged conflict started as a series of small incidents. I made sure people saw tension between Eric and me. Nothing extreme, just enough that relatives, friends, and acquaintances would notice the growing distance. We stopped appearing together at gatherings. Conversations became cold. Rumors started circulating on their own. What scares me now is how easily I justified everything. I told myself I wasn't hurting anyone. I told myself it was temporary. I told myself I was only creating a story people would believe. Meanwhile, I spent weeks thinking about how events might unfold if that story were ever tested. I paid attention to who talked to whom, who remembered details, and who loved repeating gossip. The more people accepted the conflict as real, the more confident I became. And confidence, I've learned, can be far more dangerous than desperation. By that point, the argument had taken on a life of its own. What began as a few awkward conversations turned into something people discussed when neither of us was around. Relatives would call me and ask what had happened between Eric and me. Friends would mention hearing that we were no longer speaking. Every time someone brought it up, I acted annoyed and changed the subject. That reaction made the story seem even more believable. The strange thing is that Eric didn't know the role he was playing in all of this. We had genuinely drifted apart, but he had no idea I was quietly encouraging people to view our disagreement as something much bigger than it really was. Meanwhile, my financial situation kept getting worse. The pressure followed me everywhere. I couldn't sleep properly. I checked my bank account multiple times a day, hoping numbers would somehow change. Instead of seeing the staged conflict as a warning sign, I treated it like progress. I became convinced that I was being clever. I wasn't. I was slowly creating a trap, and eventually I would be the one standing in the middle of it. The actual crime didn't appear in my mind all at once. It developed piece by piece. Eric's warehouse became the center of my attention. I'd visited it before, so I knew the general layout, the delivery schedules, and the times when the place was busiest. I also knew that inventory records weren't always updated immediately. At the time, that detail seemed important. What I was really doing was searching for opportunities and then pretending I was only being observant. Over the next few weeks, I paid attention to things I had never noticed before. Which entrances were used most often? Which employees stayed late? Which security habits were followed consistently, and which ones were ignored when people got comfortable? Every observation made the idea feel more realistic. At the same time, I continued feeding the illusion of hostility between Eric and me. Nothing dramatic, just enough to keep the story alive. By then, people expected us to dislike each other. That expectation became part of my thinking. If something went wrong, everyone would focus on the obvious explanation. And I was arrogant enough to believe that worked in my favor. For a long time, everything existed only in my head. Then one evening I sat alone in my apartment, surrounded by overdue notices and unopened envelopes, and something changed. I stopped thinking in terms of, what if, and started thinking in terms of, when. That's the moment I truly regret. I remember staring at a spreadsheet of debts and realizing I couldn't keep pretending things would somehow fix themselves. The responsible choice would have been asking for help, negotiating payment plans, or admitting that I had failed. Instead, I convinced myself that one illegal act could erase all my problems. The rationalizations came easily. I wasn't planning violence. I wasn't planning to hurt anyone physically. I told myself that made a difference. Looking back, that was just another lie I used to quiet my conscience. Over the next several days, I finalized details in my mind. I picked a date. I thought through possible complications. I imagined how people would react afterward. The more I planned, the calmer I felt. That calm should have terrified me. Instead, I took it as a sign that I was ready. The day finally arrived, and I remember feeling strangely detached from everything around me. People often imagine that committing a crime feels dramatic from the very first second. For me, it felt unreal. I went through the day pretending everything was normal. I answered messages, bought coffee, and even had a casual conversation with a neighbor. All the while, I knew what I intended to do later. As evening approached, my anxiety started building. Every small inconvenience felt significant. A delayed phone call. Unexpected traffic. A change in someone's schedule. None of it actually mattered, but my mind treated every detail as a potential disaster. When the moment came, I moved forward anyway. What shocked me most was how quickly my fear transformed into adrenaline. My thoughts became sharper, faster, and more focused than they had been in months. I wasn't thinking about consequences anymore. I was only thinking about getting through the next few minutes without attracting attention. At that point, there was no turning back. The plan was no longer an idea. It had become reality. The problem with plans is that they only work perfectly in your imagination. For weeks, I had convinced myself that I had considered every possibility. I had replayed the situation in my head so many times that I felt prepared for anything. Reality disagreed. Almost immediately, small complications started appearing. A routine I expected people to follow changed without warning. Someone showed up where I didn't expect them to be. Nothing catastrophic, but enough to force me to make decisions in the moment instead of relying on my carefully constructed assumptions. That's when the pressure really hit me. I remember constantly looking over my shoulder, worried that every glance in my direction meant someone had noticed something unusual. Ordinary conversations suddenly sounded suspicious. Innocent questions felt like interrogations. What made it worse was that I couldn't simply walk away. I had already committed myself. Every new problem demanded another choice, another adjustment, another risk. By the end of the night, I realized something important. The crime itself wasn't the hardest part. The hardest part was maintaining control once events began moving beyond my control. In the days that followed, people began doing exactly what I had expected. They searched for explanations. News of the incident spread surprisingly fast through our circle of relatives, friends, and business contacts. Everyone wanted to know what had happened. Everyone had a theory. And almost all of those theories led back to the same thing: the conflict between Eric and me. Hearing people discuss it was one of the strangest experiences of my life. I would stand there listening while they connected events together, confidently explaining motives and intentions that existed only in their imagination. The staged feud had done its job so well that people barely questioned it. Part of me felt relieved. Another part felt sick. The lie had become bigger than I expected. It no longer belonged to me. People repeated details that were exaggerated, distorted, or completely invented. Each retelling added something new. I tried to act offended whenever the topic came up. Sometimes I laughed it off. Sometimes I pretended I was tired of discussing it. But every conversation carried the same hidden danger. The more people talked, the more opportunities there were for someone to notice a contradiction. I had imagined that once everything was over, I would finally feel relief. Instead, I became paranoid. Every phone call made my stomach tighten. Every unexpected message felt like the beginning of bad news. If someone said, "Can we talk for a minute?" my mind immediately jumped to the worst possible conclusion. The strange thing was that nobody seemed openly suspicious of me. On the surface, life continued normally. People went to work, attended family dinners, and talked about everyday problems. Yet I couldn't enjoy any of it. The secret followed me everywhere. I started replaying conversations in my head after they ended, searching for signs that I might have said something wrong. I worried about details I had forgotten, mistakes I might have made, and questions I hadn't anticipated. Sleep became difficult. Some nights I lay awake for hours staring at the ceiling, mentally reviewing every decision that had brought me to that point. For a while, I convinced myself this anxiety would fade. It didn't. The crime had solved none of the problems that pushed me toward it in the first place. It had simply replaced financial pressure with something worse: fear. The first real sign of trouble appeared about a month later. It wasn't a dramatic confrontation or a knock on my door in the middle of the night. It was a simple conversation. I was speaking with a mutual acquaintance of Eric's when he casually mentioned something that caught my attention. Apparently, investigators, or at least people looking into the incident, had started asking broader questions than before. They weren't focusing only on obvious suspects. They were reviewing timelines, movements, and relationships. That comment hit me harder than I expected. Until then, I had been relying on a dangerous assumption: that people would accept the easiest explanation and stop digging. Hearing otherwise felt like cold water being poured over my head. For the rest of the day, I could barely focus. Every detail I had overlooked suddenly seemed important. I started wondering whether someone had seen something I missed. Whether a conversation I'd forgotten could come back to haunt me. Whether a tiny inconsistency could unravel everything. The worst part was not knowing. Fear thrives in uncertainty. And once doubt entered my mind, it spread faster than I could control it. Once panic took hold, I made another mistake. Instead of staying quiet and letting events unfold naturally, I started trying to manage people's perceptions. Looking back, it was a terrible idea. Desperate people rarely make careful decisions. I became overly interested in conversations about the incident. Whenever someone mentioned new developments, I paid closer attention than I should have. I asked questions I probably shouldn't have asked. At the time, I thought I was gathering information. In reality, I was drawing attention to myself. A few people even commented on it. Nothing serious. Just harmless remarks like, "You seem very interested in this," or, "I thought you were tired of talking about it." I laughed those comments off, but they stayed with me long after the conversations ended. At the same time, I kept trying to justify my actions internally. I told myself I had no choice. I blamed debt, bad luck, and circumstances. I blamed everyone except the person responsible. Me. The harder I worked to avoid responsibility, the clearer the truth became. I hadn't been trapped by my situation. I had been trapped by my own decisions. Of all the moments from that period, this is the one I remember most clearly. I ran into Eric unexpectedly at a family event. It was the first time we had been in the same room for quite a while. The tension between us, which had started as something I deliberately encouraged, now felt painfully real. For most of the evening, we avoided each other. Then, near the end of the gathering, he approached me. The conversation itself wasn't dramatic. There were no raised voices, no accusations, no threats. In some ways, that made it worse. Eric looked exhausted. He talked about the stress he had been dealing with, the uncertainty, the financial damage, and the frustration of not knowing exactly why everything had happened. He wasn't speaking as an enemy. He was speaking as someone trying to make sense of a difficult situation. I stood there listening, knowing far more than I could admit. For the first time, the consequences felt personal. Until then, I had focused mostly on my own fear, my own risks, my own problems. Hearing Eric describe what he was going through forced me to confront something I had been avoiding. Real people had paid the price for what I did. After that conversation with Eric, something changed inside me. The fear was still there, but guilt began taking up even more space. Before, I had been obsessed with protecting myself. Now I found myself thinking constantly about the damage left behind. What bothered me most was how ordinary life looked from the outside. People continued making plans, celebrating birthdays, and talking about future opportunities. I attended family gatherings and smiled when expected. I laughed at jokes. I participated in conversations. Meanwhile, there was a secret sitting in the middle of my life that nobody could see. That contrast became exhausting. I started withdrawing from people. Friends noticed I seemed distracted. Family members asked whether I was doing okay. I always had an excuse ready: stress, work, lack of sleep. The truth felt impossible to explain. By then, I understood something I hadn't appreciated before. Getting away with a crime isn't the same as escaping its consequences. Even if nobody discovers what you've done, you still have to live with the knowledge. And unlike investigators, guilt doesn't take days off. It follows you into every quiet moment. People often ask whether criminals feel relieved if they avoid being caught. I can't speak for everyone, but my experience was different. As time passed, the immediate danger slowly faded. The questions became less frequent. Conversations moved on to other topics. The incident that had once dominated everyone's attention gradually became another story from the past. From the outside, it probably looked as though I had escaped the consequences. Inside, however, things were very different. The version of myself that existed before the crime was gone. I had always believed there were certain lines I would never cross. Financial problems had convinced me otherwise. The realization was deeply unsettling because it forced me to confront a truth about my own character. I wasn't some criminal mastermind. I wasn't uniquely evil either. I was an ordinary person who made a series of selfish decisions and kept justifying them until they became something much worse. That understanding stayed with me. Years later, when I faced difficult situations, I stopped asking whether I was capable of doing the wrong thing. I already knew the answer. The real question became whether I would choose differently. Now, many years later, I can look back on the entire experience with a clarity I didn't have at the time. I was never arrested. I was never publicly exposed. As far as I know, most people never learn the truth. Some might see that as a lucky ending. I don't. The most lasting punishment wasn't legal. It was psychological. For years, I carried the memory of every lie, every rationalization, and every moment when I had the opportunity to stop and chose not to. The crime itself lasted a short time. The consequences stayed much longer. If there's one lesson I learned, it's that bad decisions rarely arrive looking dangerous. They usually appear disguised as reasonable exceptions. You tell yourself it's temporary. You tell yourself you'll fix everything afterward. You tell yourself you're doing what you have to do. That's how people slide further than they ever intended. So if you're facing desperation, debt, fear, or pressure, talk to someone. Ask for help. Accept embarrassment before you accept dishonesty. The problem you're trying to escape may feel unbearable today, but living with what you become can be far harder. William.